Fun fact, planet Earth is 4.5 billion years old. Mankind, about 140,000 years old. Let me put that in perspective. If you condense the Earth's lifespan into 24 hours, that's one full day, then we have been here on this planet for, drum roll please, 3 seconds. 3 seconds. And look what we've done. We have modestly named ourselves Homo sapiens, meaning wise man. But is man really so wise? Smart, yes, and it's good to be smart, but not too smart for your own good. Yes, we have split the atom. Yes, we build clever machines that navigate the universe in search of new homes, but at the same time, those atoms we split created nuclear warfare. In our quest to explore the galaxy, rejects and neglects the home that we have here now, so no, that cannot be wisdom. Wisdom is different. While intelligence speaks, wisdom listens, and we willingly covered our ears to Mother Nature's screams and closed our eyes to all of her help-wanted signs. Wisdom knows that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so if we were wise, we would not be shocked when we see storms that are stronger than ever before, or more drought, hurricanes, and wildfire than ever before, because there's more pollution than ever before, more carbon, more trees cut down than ever before. At a record pace, we have increased the extinction of animals by 1,000 times the normal rate. What a feat. In the next 10 to 100 years, every beloved animal character in every children's book is predicted to go extinct. Lions gone, rhinos gone, tiger, gorilla, elephant, polar bear gone. In 3 seconds. Species that have been here longer than us will be gone because of us. In this 3 seconds. In an existence shorter than a Vine video, we turn the circle of life into our own personal conveyor belt. Somebody, anybody help. We were given so much, the only planet in this solar system with life. I mean, we are 1 in a million. No, actually, scientifically, we are 1 in a billion, trillion. That's a 1 followed by 33 zeros. And I don't want to get too spiritual, but how are we not a miracle? We are perfectly positioned to the sun so we don't burn, but not too distant so we don't turn to ice. Goldilocks said it best, we are just right. This paradise where we are given medicine from trees, not coincidentally, but because like the song says, we are family. Literally, everything, every species is connected genetically, from the sunflower to the sunfish. And this is what we must recognize before it's too late, because the real crisis is not global warming, environmental destruction, or animal agriculture. It is us. These problems are symptoms of us, byproducts of us. Our inner reflection, loss of connection has created this misdirection. We have forgotten that everything contributes to the perfection of Mother Nature. Corporations keep us unaware and disconnected, but they have underestimated our strength. Contrary to popular belief, millions are waking up out of their sleep, seeing our home being taken right up under our feet. We cannot allow our history to be written by the wicked, greedy, and loony. It is our duty to protect Mother Nature from those who refuse to see her beauty. Call me crazy, but I believe we should have the right to eat food that's safe, with ingredients we can pronounce. Drink water that is clean, marvel at trees, breathe air free of toxins. These are natural rights, not things that can be bargained for in Congress. See, they want you to feel powerless, but it has been said that something as small as the flutter of a butterfly's wing can cause a typhoon halfway around the world. But when enough people come together, we too will make waves and wash the world into a new era filled with love and connection, freedom for all without oppression. But it is up to you, yes, you watching this behind this screen, to make the effort, because time is of the essence, and only together can we make it to the 4th second. We can no longer rely on those who have polluted our air, water, and sea for a solution. There will be no Iron Man coming with a super technological fix to save the world. In fact, we cannot save the world, but we can recreate the world. We must do something about our trees. Trees are so important to this planet. Destroying them is causing more than 7 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions each year. If we don't stop the destruction of the world's forests, we will not be able to solve climate change. Period. For the past year, I've been supporting Stand for Trees, a platform that puts the power of change back into the hands of the people. They allow you to take responsibility for your carbon footprint and directly protect the threatened forests, forest communities, and wildlife of the world. If millions of us support Stand for Trees right now, we could actually do something about climate change and environmental destruction. Only through the collective actions of us all will we have a future full of forests, forests that are full of life, and a planet that is full of harmony. Please join me and go to standfortrees.org to save a forest and to save our future.
Okay, welcome to week 3 of the global impacts of fashion merchandise, and thank you to Prince Ia there, who contextualized the problem that we started looking at last week in terms of the age of the earth and the time that we've been on the earth. If we look at what Prince Ia was saying in visually in terms of a timeline, if you like, this grey area here represents the age of the earth from the formation of the moon some 4.5 billion years ago. And if we keep moving around here, we'll find that humans appear just on that black line there. I don't know if you can quite see it, but hence why he was talking about the 3 seconds that humans have been on Earth. So relative to the Earth, humans' impact on the Earth's ecosystems has been quite significant or quite phenomenal. And as we said last week, remember we that gives rise to the argument that we are in the age of the Anthropocene, where humans have become the most powerful species on Earth, and therefore, whilst we have great power to do great damage, we also have great power to do great good or to rectify the situation, at least. So the story is as positive as it is negative. So before we can do that, before we can rectify the situation, we need to sort of quantify the situation. And last week I introduced you to Johan Rockström's Planetary Boundaries. That's his way of measuring at least 9 of the Earth's systems. And we were going through each one of those and asking ourselves, does it sit in the green zone, the zone of certainty, yellow zone, the zone of uncertainty, or be red zone beyond the zone of certainty? So pretty simple traffic light classification system, and we will continue on that. Just a reminder about wicked problems, and we looked at the problem with the boat and bailing water out of the boat is a problem which will never be solved. However, if you think laterally, you think outside of the square, so to speak, you may actually find a solution such as Tintin did in that case by flipping the boat upside down. So if we apply that to the fashion industry, it means we have to start thinking outside of the box to find solutions. And indeed, the industry itself will encourage and will reward those employees who think outside the box. This is an age for creative thought and creative solutions. I also looked at tipping points, and one of the ways in which we can, if I go back to this one, we can understand when a system changes, say from green to yellow or yellow to red, is to watch the tipping points, watch the point at which a farm turns into a desert. And that's when we can say, well, that piece of land is no longer productive in terms of agricultural output. But we have to actually understand the tipping points to then determine whether we've got a problem in that area or not. So last week we looked at climate change, biosphere integrity, where we said the number of species on Earth is diminishing rapidly. Prince Ia also reinforced that. Freshwater use and ocean acidification, all with their own unique problems. So what we'll do today is just run through the rest of those, and then I'll give you a bit of a timeline on the whole environmental movement. A reminder again of the Great Acceleration and then the point of about 1950, where we saw a significant increase in human activity and also consumption of the Earth's resources as a consequence of doing that. So hence the term, the Great Acceleration. And where did it come from? It didn't come from a bad place. It came from a philosophy, an American philosophy of material well-being. And the vehicle that drove that well-being was consumerism and free markets. So encourage countries to trade, encourage people to start businesses, buy and sell, and we have a better world. So hence our paradox or the problem, that we have is we do have a better standard of living throughout many parts of the world. However, the price for that standard of living has been significant environmental degradation. So how do we keep both? How do we improve the Earth's ecosystems but maintain quality of life? Okay, land system change is number 5. If we look at this one, we'll find it's in the yellow zone, the zone of uncertainty, because it definitely is changing. And what is land system change? Excuse me. So land is the foundation that supports so many other activities on Earth, from biodiversity to nutrient activity. Pretty much everything except for fish need land, because fish don't have legs, so they can't walk. But all other creatures use land, and you have to think about why we use the land. So the obvious one is we grow crops on it to produce food, but we also need land to build our homes on, and we need land to build roads, and we also need land, we as in the earth needs land to run its rivers through as well. So the actual land itself, every aspect of the land, serves a particular purpose in the ecosystem and also in the social systems. And the point that Rockström was saying back here is that the use of this land is changing, and therefore it has some consequences, such as forest, grassland, wetlands, and other vegetation types have been converted to farmland. That's why, and the direct consequence of that is just go to a supermarket where you have a wide variety of food available to eat. All of that food comes from, or most of that food comes from land. And so our desire to have, something like, I think they say there's about 30,000 lines in an average Coles or Woolworths supermarket. Our desire to have, that's not just food, that's everything, all their stock. But our desire as consumers to have a wide choice means that we need to utilize more land in order to do so. The tipping points that scientists look at, therefore, are deforestation rates, so the rate at which we're cutting down trees, and we'll look at that in the tutorials this week in Indonesia as an example. Soil fertility, every time you grow a crop, the crop is actually taking nutrients out of the soil to turn it into a vegetable or a carrot or whatever the case may be. So obviously, if you continually grow crops on the same piece of land, you actually exhaust or potentially exhaust the nutrients from that soil, so making it infertile. And so obviously farmers need to place minerals and elements back into the soil. And the other tipping point they look at is urban sprawl, is cities, and because as cities grow outwards, they consume more and more land. So there's a whole range of issues we need to look at. What we do in the fashion industry is ask ourselves, if we're going to create a range of clothes, does it affect the amount of trees being chopped down on Earth, or the fertility of soil, or even urban sprawl? Because for us in the fashion industry, that is when we build a bricks and mortar store. We actually need some land to put a retail store on there, car park, etc. And so we're taking away from the natural stock of land out there. I want to introduce you to this problem, or it's best exemplified by this little sort of scenario I'm going to give you now. Remember we said in week 1 that you're the people of two worlds, and the linear approach, the 17th to 20th century approach, gave us great materialistic well-being, but at a cost. The 21st century approach suggests we've got to look at the whole picture altogether. So let's have a look at this image of a nice, beautiful, green, lush forest, if you like. And if you present this image to an economist or a business person, they will tell you that there's no value in this. There's no monetary value in it. It only has an economic value when we do that to it. So that's worthless, that has value. That does nothing for human beings, that creates wealth for human beings. And you can see already there's a problem with this mindset or this mentality. So obviously the burning and cutting down of trees is useful because it allows us in the fashion industry to demand paper bags, which we can then use to pack our customers' garments in and send them home in those bags. Also useful for swing tags, cardboard boxes for the packaging of the garments being sent from the factory to our distribution centres and then onto our retail stores as well. So we in the fashion industry demand the deforestation of parts of the earth for our industry. The next question we have is, once we've cut down the trees, the land then becomes available to be used for the growing of cotton, which once again we need in the fashion industry for the clothing we need. And there's two choices we can make at this stage, and I'm just going to introduce them now and once again talk about it in a few weeks' time. But we can take this land and we can apply capital intensive measures such as fully mechanized agricultural farming, as you can see on the left hand side, which is really efficient use of the land to grow a significant amount of cotton. Or we can go for a labor intensive approach where we employ lots of people to grow and tend the cotton, and that creates the obvious employment benefits. So neither one is right or wrong, but whichever decision we take has consequences. Capital intensive gets the most out of the land, so it supports the argument that if you're going to cut down a forest, a beautiful green forest, to grow cotton, well then at least you should try to get the most amount of cotton you can out of that land. But to do so, if you employ that capital intensive method, you don't employ many people in that. If you go down the labor intensive path, it's not as efficient, doesn't grow as much cotton as capital intensive, but at least you're employing a lot of people. So we cut down this beautiful forest, but in exchange we employ many people and hence support their families. So as a fashion brand, we have to start thinking about which way we want to go with this, and that depends on our philosophy as a brand and what we value more: efficiency in Earth's resources, capital intensive, or supporting humans and their right to employment and a decent standard of living. Either way, it all ends up in a garment at the other end. So there's a direct correlation between, the converting this forest into clear land so that we can make that top there, the crop top that you see there. And hence we need to find a way in the fashion industry to do so without impacting or at least justifying the actions that we take when we have these impacts on the Earth's systems. If we look at urban sprawl, as I mentioned, as one of the tipping points, we're in the age of what we call the mega cities. And a few years ago, we reached a point where there were more human beings living in cities than living out in the rural areas. First time in human history that we've seen this. And so we're talking about cities that are kind of the size of Australia's population, 20 million, 25 million people. As you can see by this chart on the left, if you have a look at Tokyo, which is that's Tokyo, Yokohama, because they're all joined into one city now, or one metropolis, if you like, is just above 35 million people. Australia's population, as I said before, is just sitting on 26 million people. So what this means is it's kind of changing our definition of country. So country is not as important as cities, and cities are becoming economic engines in their own right and are becoming the powerhouse of creativity and industrial output. But they take up a significant amount of space, as you can see by this image of Shanghai in the right-hand side there. Once again, what does that mean for us? Well, that has consequences on how we retail, how we distribute to our customers, whether they come to a store, whether we go to them, whether we have big stores, small stores. All of that then comes into the mix. And as I said, we'll spend more time on this when we look at the retailing. But as a fashion brand, we've got to consider not just the garment, but how we distribute the garment, given this sprawling population that's occurring in the world. Just on this point, the evolution of cities really took off after 1750 with the Industrial Revolution. Remember that shift from agriculture to industry? At that point, all the industries are located in one place, so people from many farms started moving into the cities to get jobs in these new industries. Pretty much like you're have witnessed in China in the last 20 years, where a lot of people who lived in rural communities have, moved particularly to the East Coast, to Shanghai, Beijing, Guangzhou down south, all looking for a better place to live. So we've got that sort of phenomenon occurring in the backdrop. Number 6 is biogeochemical flows. And this is a concentration of nitrogen and phosphorus in the ecosystem. And what you'll notice here is that Rockström and his associates found that this is definitely beyond the zone of uncertainty, is that the concentrations are much greater than they were, say, pre-1950, or definitely pre-1750. And why? And once again, let me remind you, red doesn't mean danger or the end of the world or anything like that. It means it's just a different state. It's a different, and that different state has consequences for a whole range of creatures. Okay, where does it come from? So both nitrogen and phosphorus are present in the soil and air, so it's naturally occurring on Earth. Plants draw on these minerals to grow, predominantly from the soil. So they'll take it up, obviously concentrated in the plant, and then when the plant degrades, it goes back into the soil, with some of it going into the atmosphere as well. So there's a couple of images there which are sort of a little bit convoluted, but give you an idea of what occurs. So that's the natural system. We humans come along, and firstly, we involve ourselves in the system when we discover that the application of nitrogen and phosphorus allows crops to grow quicker and bigger and healthier. And so that's partly why this line, if you recall, this economic activity line, is increasing, because we've found more efficient ways to grow crops. And so now on my farm, I can grow, bigger pieces of corn. Therefore, there's more corn available in the market to sell, and we as a species become more prosperous. Another form that you would know it in is manure, basically, nitrogen and phosphorus, and that's why it grows quicker. So, nice natural cycle from cow to manure to plant, and then round and round it goes like that. However, we've become much, much more efficient at doing so in the industrial age. So again, from 1750s onwards, we've applied science to find more efficient ways of distributing the right amount of fertilizer, if you like, or nitrogen and phosphorus. And obviously it yields bigger crops like these giant pumpkins there, if you like. Great for the human race, great for produce available in the markets and supermarkets around the world. However, there's consequences to this sort of intensified approach to agricultural activity. And the effects are that the excess nitrogen and phosphorus washes into water, into the rivers, and then from the rivers out into the oceans, and it changes the chemical balance of those waterways and creates things like algal bloom or dead zones, which I'll just show you a clip in a moment. Contributes to climate change with production of fertilizer creating nitrous oxide. And this is a greenhouse gas which sits in the atmosphere for a lot longer than carbon does. So it's not as concentrated as CO2 emissions, but it's still significant in there. So the tipping points are the health of the rivers and oceans, and we just measure the chemical composition of those oceans. Let's just have a look at this clip.
Nutrient pollution is a widespread national problem and is well documented in places like the Chesapeake Bay, the Mississippi River Basin, and Puget Sound. Nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus are a natural part of the ecosystem. They support the growth of aquatic plants. But human activities cause an excess of nitrogen and phosphorus in the environment. Surface and groundwater becomes polluted, creating a serious problem known as nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution can affect you and your family's health, as it threatens our drinking water supplies and places where we like to swim and fish. Excess nutrients can also cause an explosion of algae growth called algal blooms. These can be foamy, scummy, or a thick mat of slime on the surface of the water or along the beach. Some algal blooms are harmful because they produce toxins that can make people sick. These blooms also hurt tourism, reduce property values, and drive up water treatment costs. The nutrients move downstream, killing fish and creating large dead zones where no aquatic life can survive. It's one of the most serious water pollution issues facing our nation. Nutrient pollution comes from farms, lawn fertilizer, pet waste, city streets, faulty septic systems, and sewage treatment plants. Limiting nutrient pollution from excess nitrogen and phosphorus will protect people's health, support the economy, and keep America's waters safe for swimming and fishing. Awareness is the first step in preventing and reducing nutrient pollution. Learn what you can do to make a difference at epa.gov/nutrient pollution.
So if we look at the great acceleration and in particular fertilizer consumption, what we see there is that there's an absolute dramatic increase in the use of fertilizers on farmland from the 1950s until now, which has yielded, as I said before, significant increases in the production of food, the quantity of food, also has a corresponding reduction in the price of food because there's so much out there. And one of the suggestions now by many economists is that food is in effect too cheap in the world, and it needs to, or it will start to increase in price as the full consequences of this sort of steroid approach, if you like, to food production sort of comes home to roost. So what does it mean for us? Remembering if we're using a natural fiber such as cotton, it will have fertilizers applied to it. So that's our role in the fashion industry and fertilizer consumption, and therefore the risks of further putting it out of balance, the nitrogen and phosphorus out of balance with the natural quantities out there. Okay, if we look at this in the Australian perspective, where we're seeing the effects of that is in the Great Barrier Reef up in North Queensland, where some of the reef the Great Barrier Reef is dying, or parts of it are dying, partly to do with warming sea temperatures and partly to do with runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from farmers in Queensland who are applying these fertilizers, washing out in the Great Barrier Reef and destroying it. So here's another good example of this sort of, do we want to maintain the tourist industry around the Great Barrier Reef, or do we want to maintain agricultural production in northern Queensland, or how do we get a balance between the two? These are the questions that some brands like Patagonia have been working on, and I'll introduce you to Patagonia because this is probably one of the first brands in the world that did start to acknowledge or recognize the connection between fashion and the environment. And if you look at this, I've got a video on this, I'll just show you just a little bit of this video and then I'll talk about it. No, I don't want to sign up today.
We are on a bit of an exploratory trip, checking out different parts of the reef, assessing how damaged they are, and also still taking advantage of their beauty.
We're all here to have a look and to learn what the condition really is. If there's anything I can contribute to this, it's being the underwater eyes to see what's going on and help express it and communicate it.
I've grown up on the east coast of Australia, surfing up and down the coast with my family, and I really felt like that was part of my heritage as an Australian, that coastline and knowledge behind it, and the waves got passed on to me from my father, and I would really love to have the chance to pass that on to my son.
Okay, I think you've got the idea of of what they're trying to sell there. What's really clever about Patagonia is they're doing a couple of things there. In that little short clip that we saw there, one, they're reflecting on who their target market is. So the target market can obviously see these characters and identify with those characters. So it reinforces who Patagonia is, and it reinforces Patagonia's message that they are about looking after nature, and therefore this part of the fashion industry is sorry, I'll just show you one more thing, is the front runner in doing so. I mean, if you just go down a bit, I just wanted to show you here. So they've got a campaign for Fight for Our Reef. So they're clearly, here's a brand that's clearly associating itself with an environmental cause. Again, something that many brands have been loath to do in the past, but are now being forced to do so. If we look at Quicksilver then, another lifestyle brand, and have a look at their sustainability approach. I just want to compare it, a video. So this is from a couple of years ago because there isn't one that's more recent. This is Quicksilver Sustainability Challenge.
Hi everybody, I'm Stephanie Gilmore. I'm a professional surfer, and I want to just have a little chat to you guys about the importance of keeping our oceans and keeping our earth clean. I travel the world to some of the most beautiful places, and I see the effects of plastic everywhere.
So the reason I just wanted to show you that, so obviously you picked up the poor quality of the sound in that image, but you know, you've got one brand, Patagonia, that comes up with this incredibly stylish and professional video on the environment, and then you've got Quicksilver, which is put together, which is also selling a good message, but it looks like it's put together cheaply, and it kind of, and quickly, you know, so it kind of sort of sends you a message about the emphasis that each of these brands is putting on sustainability. It's almost as if Quicksilver's doing it because they need to be seen to be doing it, but they're not really taking it seriously. And then finally, you've got Rip Curl, one of Australia's biggest global brands, based down at Torquay. And if we look at sustainability for them, what we find is absolutely nothing. So, you know, here's a brand which very much identifies with the surf, with the ocean, with the natural earth systems, but is not doing anything sort of connecting its brand and its consumers with nature other than just go for a swim, and that's the end of it. So three brands from progressive all the way to a laggard there, which just gives you an indication of how this industry is sort of evolving, and it may require those brands to recalibrate what's important to them. Okay, number 7, ozone depletion. This is probably one of the good news stories. Currently in the safe zone or in the green zone. What it is, ozone is a layer of gas that circles the Earth, as you can see here by this image, and it's the Earth's sunblock. So solar radiation, it comes off the sun, it hits this ozone layer and it can't get through, and it protects everything on Earth, including we humans, from getting sunburn, if you like, or too much radiation. In 1985, Professor James Lovelock found a hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica, and that was a real problem because obviously if there's a hole there, the radiation can come straight in, a bit like standing outside on a 40-degree day in Australia without any sunscreen on or without a hat on. Not good. And they did a little bit more research and found that the hole was a result of human activity, and the human activity was these CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons, which are predominantly found in aerosols, in air conditioning units, in refrigeration units. So it's the main gas they used to run those pieces of equipment. And when the gas leached out, as the fridges got old or the air conditioners broke down, then it would find its way into the atmosphere and eat away at the ozone layer. These CFCs started being used in the 1930s around the world. And so it was 1985 before scientists realized the consequences of what happened a full 50 years beforehand. So it allows more radiation to enter the Earth's atmosphere, causing cancer in humans and animals. So the tipping point is the hole. They just monitor the hole. But Australia, it's of particular relevance to us here in Australia because we have in Australia one of the highest levels of skin cancers in the world. 1 in 14 men and 1 in 24 women will be diagnosed with some form of skin cancer in their lifetime. So that's quite a lot. So if you do get discoloration like that in your skin, go get it checked out, because this is the country where you're most likely to get it in. And why is it in Australia? It's because we live close to the South Pole, Antarctica. So that's where the hole is. It's not just on Antarctica, and it's not still. The hole gets bigger and smaller depending on the time of year it is. As a result of the discovery of this, remember this was discovered in, let me go back, 1985. By 1987, there was an agreement that was signed off in Canada, in Montreal, called the Montreal Protocol, that required all countries in the earth to phase out these CFCs. So pretty much why it's a good news story is because it just took 2 years for 197 countries to sit down and say, yes, this is a common threat to all humanity. Let's ban these CFCs. And as Kofi Annan, Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, commented on, it's perhaps the single most successful international agreement to date. And so there's a model of when the world did work together, because there was a common threat, it can do so really, really quickly. And so unfortunately at the moment, we're kind of at the other end of the spectrum, where it looks like we're all sort of going our own separate ways, even though the only way we can solve our problems is by working together. So there is a precedent at least, and we may see it come back. Number 8, atmospheric loading. This one we don't know yet. It's too early. They haven't gathered enough evidence to determine whether it's changed or not changed. But what atmospheric loading means in scientific terms is stuff floating in the air. So an aerosol is a colloid of fine solid particles or liquid droplets in the air or other gas. Aerosols can be natural or not. They can be human created. Examples of aerosols are the fog, forest mists, if you like, geysers or streams. Artificial aerosols are haze, dust, particulate air pollutants, and smoke. So, as I say, if the day isn't clear, then there's some atmospheric loading occurring in there. Good and bad effects with this one. Obviously, if there's a lot of fog or pollution, it stops radiation from entering the Earth's atmosphere. However, the bad news is if it's in the form of dust, it makes it hard for some of us to breathe. And for some business operations like airlines, they simply can't fly. Particularly, you would have noticed whenever there's a volcano, they stop flights around the volcano because aeroplanes and some of those particles don't go well together. So the tipping points that scientists look at is the number of days with smog in a particular city, and they measure the particles per million of that. I think I've got an example coming up here. Yeah. So if we look at this image, satellite image here, this island down here that I'm circling is Singapore, obviously Malaysia there, and Indonesia just off here. And these wisps of dust or clouds are not clouds, they're actually fires. So this is the Indonesians burning some of the forests that we looked at before in that other image when we looked at paper bags, burning the forests to clear it for agricultural activity. And that smoke was going across Indonesia and Singapore, and those countries in turn were complaining to the Indonesians saying, well, you know, you're burning your forest, but you're creating atmospheric loading in our countries. So it was an example of how environmental effects impact more than one country. In fact, they're not defined by countries, they go across countries. A couple of news articles there. So in Beijing, a couple of years ago, the government had to close down the coal-fired power stations around Beijing because the smog or the pollution was so great that it was difficult for the citizens there to breathe properly. So whilst they shut down the power stations there, they had to ramp them up further away from Beijing to supply electricity. So it didn't solve the problem, it just transferred it away from Beijing, so at least those citizens could breathe. But the level of the smog and pollution is still there. Same occurred in Italy, Milan and Rome, and there the government had to ban cars, so they restricted cars. Singapore does something similar as well. If you've got even number plates on your car, you can only drive every second day, and vice versa. So so whilst it might be a slight inconvenience for you and I as a consumer, think of it in terms of logistics and having to deliver your garments to retail stores if you're now only able to do it every second day. So it's again a direct consequence or correlation between pollution and running our businesses effectively. Okay. The ninth one we'll look at, and this is the final one, is novel entities. And these are, a novel in this term simply means new. So new entities that are unknown in terms of the other effects on the 8 planetary boundaries. So more evidence needs to be gathered on this one. So currently it sits there. So examples of this are the POPs, or what we call persistent organic compounds, microplastics, and nanomaterials. And as I said, tipping points are unknown. So it makes this category particularly worrying, because at least if we can quantify the problem, we can then try to solve it. But if we don't even know it's a problem, then well, how can you solve it? A little bit like the ozone layer and the CFCs. We didn't know the chlorofluorocarbons were a problem. In fact, we thought the opposite. From the 1930s until 85, we thought CFCs were a wonderful chemical substance because it allowed us to keep our food cool and chilled in the fridges. So again, the warnings with this one are the same. We don't know, therefore we should be concerned about it. So what are the POPs? POPs are pollutants or compounds that are resistant to environmental degradation. They always are in the atmosphere, within nature in one form or another. And so it could come about through the use of pesticide spraying on crops, like this aircraft here is doing on cotton crops, for instance. And that some of those chemicals might find their way into the gut. And there's certainly a lot of research now suggesting that we do hold a portion of those chemicals in our gut, and they're not removed. The body can't get rid of them as such. And there's sort of suggestion that that's also impacting on our health. So a lot of research going on in that area at the moment. Microplastics, again, we'll look at those in the tutorials in a bit more detail. So to give you a better idea of what they are, this is this one's probably emerging as a key issue. One, because it's visible. So unlike the POPs where you can't actually see them, so it's harder to sort of focus on it or focus the mind on it. Whereas plastics is relatively easy. There's a lot of plastics. It's everywhere. We see the impact on it in terms of sea life. What we don't see is the amount of plastic that's in our bodies, because when we eat food, invariably now there is some degree of plastic in a significant portion of that food, and it gets ingested into us. And we don't have enough information to understand what happens if there is plastic sitting in our stomach. And, remember also, plastic doesn't disappear, it just gets smaller and smaller, gets placed in smaller and smaller particles, a bit like what's in this guy's hand up there. Remembering it also comes from petroleum, so it's all part of this. It's only occurred in the last 100 years, less than 100 years, that we have this concentration of plastics. There was a study done, which again is in the quiz that we'll look at in the tutes, a study done where they caught some fish off the coast of Indonesia and off the coast of California in the United States, and they found 100% of the fish caught off the coast of Indonesia had some concentration of plastic in it, and 100% of all the fish caught off the coast of California had some concentration of microfibers in there. So what's clear is that the food chain, particularly sea life, is being contaminated by plastics. And again, we'll look at examples of brands like Nike, which are doing a lot of work on trying to at least raise awareness and change the amount of plastic they use or how they use plastic in their supply chain and in their products. The third one is nanomaterials, and these are having a material having particles or constituents of nanoscale, so microscopic scale, or one that is produced by nanotechnology. So a nano is 1/1000th of a meter. So these are incredibly small particles. And probably where we're all familiar with it, or where it occurs in a product that we are familiar with, is sunblock. So a lot of sunblock is changed at the molecular level by scientists to enhance its reflective abilities or blocking abilities. That's the good part. The bad part is we don't actually know what happens when you take this cream and you rub it on your skin. Some of it does get through the skin and goes into the bloodstream, and we don't know what effect this new entity or this novel entity has on our bodies. So once again, it's an area of concern because of our ignorance on this. In terms of fashion, it's sometimes applied to stop clothes from smelling. It's also a water repellent used on fabrics and a self-cleaning fabric. It's not a big part of the industry, hasn't really gone ahead the way that some had suggested it would, but certainly an area of concern. So, in summary, we looked at 9 Earth systems to help understand that when we do put a range of clothes together, when we do create them and retail them, we want to ask ourselves, does it affect any of these 9 systems, and how does it affect it? It helps give us context to whether we're doing, the right thing or the wrong thing. The last thing I want to do is spend about 10 minutes at the most going through an environmental timeline on how we got to this point that we're at the moment. Reason being, it just gives us a bit of a context and helps us understand why certain decisions are made and indeed not being made on this important issue. So if I was to start anywhere, and there's a myriad of places you could start at, there's not as if there's one definitive timeline on the environmental movement around the world, but I'm going to start with Rachel Carson's seminal book, Silent Spring, which she released in 1962. And in this book, she made some observations and came to the conclusion that I think she was in the Midwest, the US she was located in, and she was noticing a lot of deformities in some of the birds and other animals and creatures in that part of the world. And she suggested that the deformities were a result of the pesticides being sprayed on farmland nearby. Now today you might say, yeah, so what? That's obvious. In 1962 it wasn't obvious. In 1962 it's a different context, different world, and industrial chemicals were seen as a good thing. They allowed humans to have a better standard of living because there was an abundance of food, etc. So here was a person, not only a person, but a woman, who was challenging the entire industrial chemical system and questioning the efficacy of it. And so that sort of got a lot of people interested in the connection between what people do and nature. In 1971, a few years after that, the Club of Rome issued a book called The Limits to Growth. And the Club of Rome was just a group of people who came together to discuss issues about what it means to be wealthy or rich or to have a healthy economy. And this was, again, a pretty challenging idea that you can't grow an economy forever. Up until that point, countries were measured by the success in their economic growth. The faster you grow, the more successful you are. You still see that same language being spoken in Australia, the United States, China, Europe, all around the world. Grow the economy. These guys came along and says you can't, because to grow the economy means basically you have to extract more resources from the earth, and you can't keep doing that. So that led to more discussion and thinking on this idea of, can we really just keep cutting down trees forever? In 1983, the World Commission on Environment and Development was formed, and their objective was to address the growing concern about the accelerating deterioration of the human environment and natural resources and the consequences of that deterioration for economic and social development. So in the early 80s, there was a recognition that, oh gee, we are really starting to do damage to the Earth's ecosystems. Is that a problem for us? And off they went to do research in that. Again, a couple of years after that, there was a discovery of the hole in the ozone layer. And as I said, in 87, there was an agreement to stop it. So there's a significant momentum in the early and mid 80s to acknowledge and recognize that the environment was a real issue for all human beings, and some positive outcome were coming out of it. 87, all the world leaders got together in Norway, I think it was, and discussed these issues, and it came out in the form of a book called Our Common Future, or the Brundtland Report. And it concludes that preserving the environment, addressing the global inequities and fighting poverty could fuel, not hinder, economic growth. Up until that stage, the prevalent economic idea was that poor countries were poor because they were lazy and underdeveloped, and it was their own fault, basically. That was the way it was perceived. This Brundtland report started to challenge that and say, well, hang on, maybe preservation of the environment actually could be a positive. And so the idea of a green economy or a sustainable economy is sort of born out of discussions such as these ones. 87, the same year, the Union of Concerned Scientists, so this is a group of scientists from around the world, signed a letter basically warning to humanity, stating that human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. So there was a greater awareness now that economic activity and what we do and nature are not working together. They're actually banging up against each other, and it's becoming a greater problem. As a result of a number of these momentum or issues, if you like, and questions, the United Nations created the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose job it was to produce a report card on the health of the planet. So start to measure it, a bit like Johan Rockström's doing with his 9 planetary boundaries. And the idea is, if we read this, established to assess the scientific, technical and socioeconomic information relevant for the understanding of the risk of human-induced climate change. Once again, if you don't measure something, you don't know you're doing damage to it. And so they came out in 1990 with their first assessment, or their first report card. And I want to read some of this to you because this helps form the narrative. emissions resulting from human activities are substantially increasing the atmospheric concentration of the greenhouse gases, the CO2 emissions that I was talking about earlier. An average rate of global mean sea level rise of about 6 centimetres per decade over the next century was their suggestion. However, they concluded by saying in this very first report that there are many uncertainties in our predictions. They didn't know enough. This was a whole new field. What they started to discover very early on is that geology was related to meteorology, and so all these different fields were actually interrelated, and they hadn't been conditioned, scientists hadn't been conditioned to work together on these issues. They only worked on their little sections of it, but now starting to see that, oh, we actually have to work together. So it was a learning curve for many of the Earth scientists. 1992, an Earth Summit was held in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, and again, momentum was growing as well. Participants adopt the Agenda 21, Blueprint for Sustainable Development, that called for improving the quality of life on Earth by using natural resources more efficiently. So this is a new term, efficiency in using resources. Up until then, you just used what you needed to use. You didn't think about nature the way we do now. Protecting global commons. These global commons are areas shared by all people, such as the oceans. Better managing human settlements and reducing pollutants and chemical waste. So the United States was present there. Their leadership position was unsurmountable because at that stage the Soviet Union had collapsed, so communism was in retreat, and the Americans were sort of gloating in the victory of that and starting to set the global agenda on this issue as well. And they were indeed at that stage a leader in the environmental debate and sustainability. In 1994, the International Conference on Population and Development concluded that the best way in which you can contain human population, as we said, we're seeing it now grow at 80 million people per year. The best way to contain that was to emphasize the importance of women's education and access to reproductive health care. Basically, they said you've got to empower women to make decisions about how many babies they want to have. And if you do that, you will naturally temper population growth. Part of the problem now is, cultural, religious attitudes about how big a family should be, and also the fact that maybe the woman doesn't have the sole right to choose how many children they have. It's at worst it's the man who chooses. At best it's the both of them together that choose it. So again, just showing from the social perspective and how that relates to the environment. In 95, the second assessment comes through, and what we see here in this report card is that concentration of greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. The anthropogenic, which is human, created aerosols, pollutants that we looked at just before, tend to produce negative radiative forces, so they're not good. Basically, the pollutants in the atmosphere are not good. Climate has changed over the past 100 years, and on the balance of evidence, there's a suggestion of a discernible human influence on global climate change, global climate. So remember, in 1995, it still wasn't certain that humans were responsible for what was happening to the climate. It was still an unknown. Climate is expected to continue to change in the future, and they concluded by saying there are still many uncertainties. So they still didn't have enough information to positively conclude that an understanding of what was happening to the environment. I'll just jump across this, but this goes through the process for the IPCC reports. They're incredibly exhaustive processes involving up to 5,000-6,000 scientists to write these different or contribute to these reports. They're big reports. You can download them from the United Nations site if you like. In 97, the Kyoto Protocol was agreed to, that developed countries cut their carbon dioxide emissions by 6 to 8%. So again, this was this tension I was saying before about the people up in the tree and the people down the bottom of the tree, from 6 to 8% from 1990 levels. But the protocol's controversial emissions trading scheme, as well as debates over the role of developing countries, cloud its future. So lots of debate, but there was some movement on this. This was the issue. If you look at CO2 emissions from 1850, Industrial Revolution, till 2011, 27% of all the CO2 emissions came out of the United States, 25% out of the European Union. So just over half of all emissions over the last 150 years came from Western Europe and the United States. And so countries, developing countries like China, like India, were saying, well, why should we cut emissions when you Americans and you Europeans have polluted for the last 150 years? Why can't, and given that pollution equates to economic development and a better standard of living. So who should pay or bear the burden of reducing emissions if it means a drop, an impost to the economy? And that's still largely the debate that's occurring today. In 98, the ozone layer grows to over 25 million square kilometres. So there's again a concern that even though the CFC emissions had been reduced, the chemicals had been eliminated, the hole was still growing. Third assessment in 2001, and have a look at this. They're saying new and stronger evidence that most of the observed warming of the last 50 years is attributable to human activities. So the scientists are growing more and more confident in their assertions as to why these changes are occurring. It's basically us. 2002, the European Union ratifies the Kyoto Protocol. So one of the biggest polluters in the world says, yes, okay, we'll start to cut our emissions. However, it leaves two countries in the world who did not sign it, and they're the ones in the red. The United States and Australia, with the two countries that refused to stop emitting pollution. And the reason being, from Australia's perspective, it would be a big impost, or a significant impost, on our economy, and we didn't want to do that. And the United States was equally on the same sort of footing. They wanted to be free. So at that stage, it came incredibly close to signing this agreement, which would not have solved all of the problems, but certainly would have gone a long way in sort of redirecting human activity towards being mindful of the environment. So these have been the two pariah states in the world for the last 20 years. And basically the rest of the world said, well, if Australia and the US don't sign it, why should we? And so some countries abided by the Kyoto Protocol, other ones ignored it. Fourth assessment in 2007, warming of the climate system is unequivocal. So here the language now gets incredibly strong and certain. Most of the observed increases in global average temperatures since the mid-20th century is very likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. So in that year as well, we had a new Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, and Kevin Rudd signed the Kyoto Protocol, leaving the United States as the only developed country to not have agreed to cutting CO2 emissions in the atmosphere. And this is where you start seeing a big change from when I said before about Brazil and the United States leading the world on this issue, to the United States being the one country that just refused to sign up on it or participate in it. So is it the end of the great acceleration and the promise of, do we continue down that path? Is it the end of that sort of type of economic development? Everything starts to be questioned now. 2009 in Copenhagen, there was another conference, and this one was a failure. Everyone left the meeting very dejected. 87, we had the Montreal Protocol, where the world agreed very quickly to solve the problem of the ozone layer, the hole in the ozone layer. 2009, there was just no agreement. So it was quite a low point. 2012, they tried again and again, absolute failure. The world was more divided than ever before on the problems that we face collectively as a species. Fifth assessment in 2014, and again, human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history, so they're getting quite high and even higher than what scientists had predicted. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and since the 1950s, so this is the first time they mention the 1950s, so an acknowledgement to the Great Acceleration, many of the observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. Oceans and the atmosphere have warmed, the amounts of snow and ice have diminished, and sea level has risen. So there are definitely changes. So, 10 years ago on this issue, they were still talking about, okay, we can stop the changes if we alter the way we do things. Now the language is more about how we survive these changes, how we adapt to these changes. So we've gotten past the point of having the same climatic systems that we had in the past. It's going to be a different system in the future. A positive note in 2015 was a Paris Climate Change Conference, and at this stage, as you can see in the image there, we had Barack Obama was the leader of the United States, and they came back and again, sort of using the old framework of Kyoto, finally agreed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to limit global temperatures to 2% above pre-industrial levels. So it was a good news story where people thought, okay, we're back on track here. It was a non-binding agreement, so it was more symbolic than anything else, but it was the first sort of stepping stone to getting something more concrete in place. And so there was a renewed optimism in the world that things actually could be done and we could work together. However, in January of 2017, we had a new president in the White House in the United States, and he had a very different opinion on climate change. He basically didn't believe it was real or true. Therefore, he agreed to remove the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, saying there was no need for that there. And once again, the world sort of had to recalibrate and say, well, what do we do if the United States is not going to take a leadership role on this issue? What happens next? Yeah, so there's just a few notes of them. He sort of, a lot of uncertainty. Didn't pull out. And so what we saw in 2008 in Poland, in the Warsaw Conference, is that China stepped up and took a leadership role on the environment. China's been doing a significant amount on this issue, from production and installation of solar panels to new scientific ways, new science, using science, I should say, to come up with new innovative ways of generating electricity or conserving electricity. So here we started saying, okay, is this a shift in the power balance where the US has kind of made itself irrelevant by not being involved in this issue, and China saying, okay, we'll take the lead on it. And just one example of that, China, and we'll look at this a bit later on in the lectures, China decided to ban the importation of garbage, because up until that point, a lot of garbage from Western Europe and Australia would be sent to China, and they would sort it and reprocess it. And partly the Chinese did it for symbolic reasons, to say, we're not going to take the world's garbage anymore, deal with it yourself. And partly it was also to say that there are consequences to garbage. You can't just put it on a ship and send it to another country and don't think about it. Out of sight, out of mind with that. So we still wait to see whether China will maintain that role as the leader when it comes to changing the environment. So we watch 2020, particularly next year, 2021. There's an election this year in November. We'll see what happens, who wins that one, and what result it produces. But we're in a kind of mixed up era of uncertainty at the moment, where there is no strong direction, no unified sort of leadership on this issue. And alternatively, like what Prince Ea said at the start, it looks like the actions of individuals all over the planet is actually having is driving the change, rather than, letting politicians drive the change. We wait to see. Okay, thank you for that. I know it was a lot of information in this week's lecture. Every week's not this bad, where you've got a ton of information. But again, it's just to give us that sort of foundational understanding of this issue before we launch into creating a range in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. See you next week.